It all started like a regular camping trip, or at least that's how I want to remember it. The night was crisp, and the forest air felt refreshing. I had just finished a grueling week of work, so when my friends invited me to join them for a weekend getaway in the mountains, I jumped at the chance. There were 6 of us: Jake, Emily, Ben, Sarah, Chris, and me, Kyle. We were a pretty close-knit group, always up for some outdoor adventure. I had been camping before, so nothing really seemed out of the ordinary when we set up our tents and started the fire. We arrived at the site late in the afternoon, with just enough daylight to set up camp. The sun was slipping behind the horizon, casting eerie long shadows across the forest. But there was something unsettling about it, something that felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but the air felt thick, almost as if something was watching us. By the time night fell, we were gathered around the fire, talking about old memories and telling stories. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual banter. The flames crackled, sending occasional sparks up into the cold night sky. But then it happened. I heard something in the distance. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon. But then it came again, closer this time. It sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I glanced at the others, but they were too busy laughing and chatting to notice. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But the noises didn't stop. They kept getting louder. I stood up, walking to the edge of the clearing, straining my ears to listen. My flashlight beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but shadows and twisted branches. My heart raced, and a sense of dread crawled up my spine. The sound was now unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. I turned back to the campfire, my throat tight with unease. "Did anyone hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking a bit more than I wanted to admit. Jake, the most level-headed of us, looked at me with a puzzled expression. "You mean the wind?" he asked. "No, something's out there," I replied, though even I didn't sound convinced. The others shrugged it off, assuming it was just the woods settling. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something natural. I wish we had packed up right then, but none of us did. To this day, I can still hear the sound of those footsteps, and I wish I could forget the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the noise that unsettled me. It was the overwhelming sense that we weren't alone. I should have known that night would mark the beginning of something far worse than I could have ever imagined. And I should have left, but I stayed. That night, the noises didn't stop. They came in waves, sometimes faint, like a rustle in the leaves, other times clear, like someone deliberately stepping in the dead, dry foliage. It was as if whoever or whatever was out there was circling us. We sat by the fire for a while, trying to shrug off the unease that had settled in. But none of us spoke much after I mentioned the sounds. Jake kept trying to keep the mood light, cracking jokes and pretending to be a tough guy, but his laughter sounded hollow. "Let's play a game," Emily suggested after a long silence, trying to break the tension. She was always the one who wanted to keep the group together. We sat in a circle, playing cards and drinking beers, but none of us truly relaxed. Every rustle in the bushes, every movement in the dark made us all jump. After a few hours, we decided to go to bed. We had one big tent that we shared, and I settled into my sleeping bag, feeling the cool night air against my face. The campfire had burned out, leaving us in total darkness, the only sound the wind whispering through the trees. I don't know when it happened exactly, but I woke up to the unmistakable feeling of being watched again. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My eyes darted around in the dark, trying to adjust to the blackness. Then, just as I was about to close them again, I heard it. The sound of something scraping against the side of our tent. Slow, deliberate. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was it an animal? No, this was different. This was too calculated. I reached for my flashlight, trying to keep quiet, but as soon as I turned it on, the scraping stopped. I hesitated, holding my breath, waiting. I flashed the light toward the spot where I'd heard the sound, but saw nothing, just the dark outline of trees in the distance. I gently shook Jake awake, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jake," I heard something outside. He groaned, not fully awake, and turned over. "It's probably just a bear or something," he mumbled, dismissing my concern. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something worse. That sound wasn't from an animal. It was too deliberate. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the eerie silence, until I finally managed to drift off again. But it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I kept dreaming of dark figures in the woods, figures that were watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, everyone was up early, rubbing their eyes and stretching in the sunlight. The night had been cold, but the sun was now strong, casting long shadows over the camp. We ate a quick breakfast, and despite the unease I still felt, we decided to take a hike. As we walked through the dense trees, the world around us felt quiet, almost too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. Then, I saw it. Just a glimpse, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. A figure, standing between two trees in the distance. A man, or at least I thought it was a man. He was completely still, watching us. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse racing. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, but the others had already continued walking, oblivious. I looked back, my stomach sinking, but the figure was gone. At that moment, I knew something was terribly wrong. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was terrified. We had been camping in that forest for hours, and no one had mentioned seeing anyone else. There was no way a person should be out here, especially not alone, not this far from the nearest trail. As we continued our hike, I kept my eyes on the woods, half expecting that man to jump out at any second. But he never did, or at least not yet. I just kept thinking, if we had seen him, who else might be out there with us? The rest of the hike was uneventful, but the dread that had settled in my stomach never left. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking just out of sight. The others laughed and joked, unaware of the sense of danger that clung to the air like a thick fog. I wanted to say something, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. Not when they were all so relaxed. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. When we returned to camp, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. The forest around us felt different now, more oppressive, as though the trees were closing in, whispering things I couldn't quite understand. We started to pack up, making plans to leave in the morning, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that we weren't alone. Something was watching us. I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the trees, but when I turned my head, there was nothing there. My mind was unraveling. As night fell, we gathered around the fire again, the flames flickering in the growing dark. The air was colder now, and the wind had picked up, howling through the branches overhead. There was no sound of wildlife, no chirping of crickets or hoots of owls, just the wind and the crackling of the fire. The silence was suffocating, and my paranoia began to escalate. I looked around at my friends. They seemed so normal, so unaware. Emily and Ben were laughing about something, and Chris was roasting marshmallows, lost in his own world. But Jake was staring into the woods, his face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, leaning closer to him. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on something just beyond the firelight. Then, in a low voice, he whispered, "Did you hear that?" I didn't answer at first. I hadn't heard anything. The wind howled again, sending a shiver down my spine. But then, I heard it too, a faint rustling, like something moving through the trees, just on the edge of the clearing. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. Then, something moved, just at the corner of my flashlight's beam. A shadow. It was tall and thin, blending into the trees. I could barely make it out, but I knew it wasn't one of us. I turned back to Jake, my blood running cold. "What do we do?" Before he could respond, Emily screamed. I whipped around, my flashlight bouncing off the trees as I ran to her. She was pointing toward the fire, her face pale as a ghost. "Look!" she shouted, her voice cracking. There, in the flickering firelight, standing just outside the circle, was a figure. A man. His face was obscured by a dark hood, but his silhouette was unmistakable. He was tall, too tall, and unnaturally thin. His limbs seemed to stretch and bend in ways that didn't feel natural. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at us with a hollow, empty gaze. I froze, paralyzed with fear. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was he real? Was this some kind of sick joke? "Who are you?" Jake called out, his voice steady, but I could tell he was as terrified as I was. The figure didn't answer. It just stared, unmoving. It felt like hours passed, though it was probably only seconds, before the figure slowly turned and stepped into the darkness, disappearing into the trees without a sound. We didn't say anything. We just stood there, wide-eyed and frozen in place. Then the strange sound returned, the same slow, deliberate footsteps, now all around us, encircling the camp. Someone or something was out there. It was too close now. Without a word, we grabbed our things and ran, panic setting in. I don't even know where we were running to, but we didn't want to stay there, not with that thing watching us. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest ranger station, breathless and covered in sweat. I don't know if it was the figure in the woods or the footsteps we heard in the dark, but something was following us. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still out there, waiting. None of us spoke about what we saw for the rest of the night. The terror was too fresh, too raw. But we all knew. We knew we had come face to face with something that shouldn't have existed, something that wasn't human. I've never gone camping again, and I never will. The days that followed felt like a blur, as if I was living in a fog. We all went our separate ways after the night at the ranger station. I remember Jake and I kept exchanging texts, both of us trying to make sense of what we'd experienced, but it felt like words couldn't capture the horror of it. We never spoke about it directly, though. No one did. It was like an unspoken agreement between us, something that couldn't be explained, so we chose to pretend it never happened. But I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't the same. Something in me had snapped that night, something I couldn't quite fix. The forest, the figure, the footsteps. It all felt like a part of me now, like a scar I couldn't wash off. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. A few weeks later, I came across an article online. It was one of those clickbait headlines, you know? Something like disappearances in the mountains, unsolved mysteries or whatever. Normally, I would have scrolled past it, but I don't know why. I guess something made me click. As I read through the article, I felt my blood run cold. It was about a series of disappearances from the very area we had camped in. The article described the strange disappearances over the years, all involving groups of people who went missing without a trace. No signs of struggle, no clues, just empty campsites and a few unsettling reports from those who had been nearby. But what chilled me to the bone wasn't the disappearances themselves. It was the details about the last known sightings of the victims. In every case, the people who had disappeared had seen a tall, thin figure standing just outside their campsites, staring at them. The description was always the same. A man with long limbs and a hood obscuring his face, moving in unnatural ways. The article mentioned that some survivors reported hearing strange footsteps in the woods, footsteps that circled their camps, just like we had heard. I felt my heart drop into my stomach as I read on. The article referenced something that struck me like a punch to the gut, a local legend. They called him the Watcher. According to the legend, the Watcher was an entity that haunted those woods, a twisted figure that had existed for centuries. The stories varied, but the core of the legend remained the same. The Watcher would appear to those who ventured too deep into the forest, observing them for days, learning their habits, studying them like prey. And then, when the time was right, he would make his move. He wouldn't take them right away, though. No, he was patient. He would wait, sometimes for years, until the fear had rooted deep into the soul of the person who had seen him. And when they were finally at their breaking point, he would come, claiming them without a trace. Couldn't breathe. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The description of the Watcher was almost identical to what I had seen that night. And the footsteps that circled our camp, were the same ones the survivors had heard. I thought I was going crazy, but reading that article, I realized something. I wasn't. We had been targeted. We had been watched. I don't know why we were chosen, but I know one thing for sure. The Watcher is still out there, watching, waiting, and I can't help but wonder if the nightmare is really over. I keep hearing the footsteps in my head, like they're still out there, pacing just beyond the edge of my vision. I sometimes feel a presence when I'm alone in my apartment, that same eerie feeling of being watched. The shadows in my room seem to stretch longer than they should, and every time I hear a rustle outside, my heart skips a beat. I don't know how many of us were truly safe that night. Some of the others haven't been the same since. Chris, for example, stopped talking to any of us. I think he knows deep down that whatever happened out there, whatever we saw, it's not something that just goes away. Ben and Sarah? They left the country. They moved to another state and disappeared from our lives completely. I wish I could say it was over, but as I sit here now writing this, I can still feel it. The cold presence, the knowledge that something is out there, in the woods, waiting for the next group of campers to stumble upon its territory. If you ever plan to go camping in the mountains, especially in the area we went, please, for your own safety, turn around. Don't stay the night, because you never know when the Watcher is watching you. And when you realize he's there, it might be too late. It's been months since I first read that article, but I can't escape the feeling that I'm still being watched. I try to ignore it, brush it off as paranoia, but deep down I know it's real. The nightmares haven't stopped. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that forest, the sounds of footsteps echoing around me, the figure lurking just beyond my reach. I've woken up in cold sweats, my heart racing, convinced that the Watcher is still out there, waiting for me. I've tried to tell myself I'm imagining things, that the fear is just a lingering echo of that night. But then there are the strange occurrences, small things, things that shouldn't be happening, not in a place that should be safe. It started with my apartment. I moved into a new place after the trip, thinking I could start fresh, that the memories of that trip would fade. But they haven't. The first thing that happened was a series of knocks. At night, I would hear faint tapping on my window, soft at first, almost like a tree branch brushing against the glass. But when I checked, there was nothing there. No wind, no branches, just empty space. Then the footsteps started. I'd hear them at night, walking slowly outside my door. They always came at the same time, around 2 a.m., just like the ones I heard around our campsite. At first, I thought it was just some neighbors, maybe someone coming home late. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too slow. It was as if whoever or whatever was out there knew I was listening. The sound would stop just as soon as I turned on the lights, but I could still feel the presence, that cold, heavy weight hanging in the air. The worst part is that it wasn't just happening at night anymore. One morning, after a particularly restless night, I woke up to find a message on my phone. It was from an unknown number, and when I opened it, my blood ran cold. The text was simple: "I'm watching." No name, no other words, just that chilling sentence. I didn't know what to do. I deleted the message, tried to convince myself it was a prank. But something told me it wasn't. It wasn't just a coincidence. I had no idea who sent it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to that night in the woods. That same night, I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't outside my apartment. They were inside. I woke up, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps on the hardwood floor. I lay still, barely breathing, straining my ears to listen. They came closer, each step heavier than the last, until I could hear them right next to my bed. Then, just as I was about to turn on the light, the footsteps stopped. And in the dead silence that followed, I heard something else. A whisper, a voice, just inches from my ear. "I'm here." I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty, but the presence was still there, lingering in the shadows, just out of sight. I searched the room frantically, but there was no one. Since then, it's only gotten worse. I've tried to leave. I've gone to stay with friends, even rented a hotel room just to get away from my apartment. But wherever I go, the footsteps follow. The whispers, the cold, unsettling presence. It's as if it's attached to me, like a shadow I can't escape. A part of me wonders if this is it, if this is the price for seeing the Watcher. Maybe once you've been marked, there's no going back. Maybe I'm not just being haunted by what I saw in the woods, but by something far worse. Something that follows those who cross its path, dragging them deeper into its twisted grasp. I don't know what the Watcher wants, but I'm beginning to think it's not just me that he's after. I've tried reaching out to the others, Jake, Emily, Ben, but none of them are answering. They've all vanished from my life, almost like they've been swallowed by the same darkness that's now haunting me. The more I try to uncover, the more I realize that whatever happened out there in the forest, it's far from over. The Watcher is still out there, and it's not done with me. And no matter how far I run, no matter how many times I change my number or move, I can still hear it. The footsteps, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. I don't know how much longer I can keep running. I've tried everything. I've moved across the city, changed my routine, even consulted with a paranormal investigator, desperate for answers. But no one can help. The Watcher is still here. It follows me wherever I go, like an invisible force that presses on my chest, suffocating me with its presence. The whispers have gotten louder, the footsteps closer. I can't sleep, can't focus. My world has become a prison of my own mind, and it's all because of that night in the woods. But there's one thing I know for sure now. I can't run anymore. I've spent months trying to escape, but now I understand something that I didn't before. The Watcher doesn't want me to run. He wants me to face him. The messages, the footsteps, the whispers. They were all leading up to this moment, a final confrontation. I have no idea what he is, or why he's been haunting me, but I've realized that no matter where I go, he will follow. There's only one way to end this, to stop the terror that's been haunting me for so long. I have to go back to the forest. I don't know if I'll survive. I don't know if anyone will. But if this is the price I have to pay to end it, then I'm willing to face whatever it is that's been following me all this time. I packed my bags that night, not telling anyone where I was going. I didn't want anyone to get caught up in this, and I couldn't bear the thought of bringing them back to that place. As I drove, my mind kept racing, replaying every moment of that night. The figure standing just outside the firelight, the footsteps, the cold, eerie feeling of being watched. I don't know why I'm doing this. Maybe it's out of desperation, maybe out of some twisted sense of closure. But I can't live like this anymore, always looking over my shoulder, always hearing those footsteps in the dark. I parked at the edge of the forest, the place where we had camped months ago. It looked just like I remembered, silent, desolate, and unnervingly still. The trees seemed taller, more oppressive, as if the forest itself was waiting, watching. I took a deep breath and stepped into the woods, the familiar crunch of dry leaves beneath my feet. I felt the presence almost immediately, like a weight on my shoulders, as if the forest itself had come alive. The cold air stung my face, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into the woods, like a moth to a flame. I walked for what felt like hours, the shadows growing longer, the silence more suffocating. Every step I took, I could feel the Watcher getting closer. I didn't turn around, didn't look back. I knew if I did, I wouldn't have the courage to continue. But I could hear him, his footsteps, his breathing, even though there was no one there. It was as if he was right behind me, just out of sight. Finally, I reached the clearing, the same one where we had set up camp. The fire pit was still there, cold and abandoned, but everything else was different. The air was thick, charged with something dark, something ancient. And then I saw him, the Watcher. He stood just beyond the trees, taller than I remembered, his limbs twisted in ways that shouldn't be possible. His face was still hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, burning into my soul. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. In that moment, I understood. He wasn't just some entity in the woods. He was part of the forest itself, part of the land, a manifestation of its darkest secrets. He was the one who had been watching over this place for centuries, guarding it, waiting for those who dared to enter. And now he had finally caught me. I felt the terror wash over me, but at the same time, I felt a strange calm. This was it. This was the moment I had been running from, the moment I knew would come. I couldn't escape him anymore. I had to face him. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing just a few feet away from the figure. I could feel the coldness radiating from him, like he was made of the forest itself. His presence a part of every tree, every stone, every shadow. And then, for the first time, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." His voice was low, gravelly, like the sound of dry leaves rustling in the wind. But it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, filling my mind, my body, every inch of me. Couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was frozen, paralyzed by his words, by his power. And then, without warning, he reached out. The darkness around him seemed to expand, swallowing everything in its path, until the entire forest was consumed by it. The trees, the sky, the ground, all disappeared, leaving only the two of us, alone in the infinite void. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was gone. Could have been seconds, or it could have been years. But when I woke up, I was lying in the clearing again, the forest quiet and still. The watcher was gone. I don't know if I survived or if it was all just a twisted dream. But I'm here, writing this, and I know I've finally broken free from him. At least I think I have. But something tells me that the watcher is always watching. And if you ever go camping in those woods, know this. He's waiting for you, too. And when he comes for you, you'll never escape. Did you like these stories? Write in the comments. And please write what you didn't like. It will be useful for me to know your opinion. And I will improve my work. Thank you. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell so as not to miss new stories. I try for you.